Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Lee, and I am with Core Medical. And I am here today to talk with you about neurodiversity and what that really looks like, um, what that means, how do we recognize and understand the differences between neurotypical and neurodiverse people, and then really talk about how do we support if we have people in our lives who are considered neurodiverse, especially children, because I think that's something that I get a lot of questions about in my practice is like, hey, I have a kiddo who's considered in this neurodiverse world, and I really don't know what to do. And so, how do we work with that a little bit as well? I will say this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I think we have heard this buzzword neurodiverse a lot over the last few years. And a lot of people don't actually know what that means, or really truly understand what qualifies or what neurodiverse looks like. And so I'm excited to kind of explain that and show everybody what that looks like. So first I want to start off by doing a little bit of an activity. And this one's going to be slightly different than some of the ones I do before, as it's not going to be necessarily what we call a grounding activity. But what I actually want to have you think about, just to get our mindset into the right place, is when we hear the word neurodiverse, if you could just think about or write down, if you have a pad and paper next to you, some of the first things that come to your mind. Um, and this is really just for ourselves to say like, okay, what things do I actually have like preconceived in my brain? And then as we go through this presentation, really talking about what neurodiversity looks like, seeing how that compares, right? And what things have we heard? Maybe it's stuff you've seen on TikTok or Facebook or whatever that looks like. But just kind of what that word means to us or what that looks like in our lives, right? I get a lot of people who come to me and will say, somebody used the term neurodiverse for my kiddo or my neighbor or my husband or my partner, and I don't know what to do with that. Like, I don't actually know what that means. I've seen all these things online, and the thing I usually first tell them is, please don't just look at online things because that's not always correct information. So awesome. So let's start out with really defining what neurodiversity is. Okay. Um, so neurodiversity refers to the unique ways our brain works. Okay. So it doesn't mean that our brain is completely different from everybody else's. It doesn't mean that there's a developmental problem or things like that. What it means is that the brain developed differently. And there's a lot of different ways that the brain can develop differently, right? So some of the examples I'd like to give is that if we know people who are extremely intelligent but lack social skills, right? Or maybe lack the ability to really understand or read a room. I hear this a lot from people. Maybe it's somebody who feels like they have so much happening in the brain. So there's lots of ideas and they kind of jump from subject to subject to subject, right? When our brain develops differently than what we would consider a neurotypical person, it means that parts of our brain actually exceed growth than other parts. So I like to use the example of somebody who would be classified as twice exceptional, meaning that their brain, their intelligence level, their cognitive abilities are super strong, right? We see people who can figure out problems in a flash, who might be able to think 10 steps ahead in a project rather than two. These people really can think ahead. And there's something else underneath that then doesn't develop as fast. And usually that's some sort of social skill or emotional things because their cognitive part of their brains essentially sucked up a lot of juice in the beginning, and the lower parts didn't suck up as much juice. And so they are growing at a different rate than their cognitive brain, right? This is kind of what we see, or a really good example of saying, like, how does our brain actually develop differently than other people? Now, this is not true for every category of neurodiversity. Right? But it's really thinking about some parts of our brain are developing in a completely different way than other parts, and that's really what it's looking like. So the the cool thing to really think about is people who have neurodivergent or who are not um, what we consider neurotypical actually have some really cool skills that they can implement in their life and can be implemented in their workplace as well, or their relationships or other pieces like that. So the first one is cognitive skills. What we typically see from people who are part of the neurodiversity community or neurodiverse community is that they have really heightened cognitive skills, meaning that they can have an analysis of something way before everybody else, or they can see unique things or problems and situations that other people might not be able to see. Um, they're really detailed. They're people who can say, like, okay, I actually can break things down to a very minute scale so we can understand the entire process instead of just a broadened picture. We usually see these folks have really heightened mathematical skills, engineering skills, things like that. And so we see that part of their brain really working on double speed, right? The other piece is creative thinking. And so this is something that a lot of people don't actually think about when they think of neurodiverse communities, is that their creativity is actually really high. That also has to do with the cognitive part of their brain developing really quickly, right? So they have to be creative in problem solving and being able to create an environment for themselves that works for them. They're usually able to see a bigger picture, meaning I can see the end result and what that looks like, and I can think of unique ways to get there that are going to be helpful or innovative. And so that is something that we really want to dive into as well, because they could probably think of things that outside of the box that even we can't think of as neurotypical communities. Um, the other piece is that their intention and concentration can also be a strength for them. A lot of times they are really hyper focused on being able to solve problems or solve certain things. They will stick with it until it's solved. And the other thing is they usually have attention to detail. Now, what I usually get as a pushback of this is, well, I know somebody who has ADHD or ADD, and it's really hard for them to stick with that. So how does that work for them? Again, in the neurodiverse community, everybody has a different skill set. And my question back to people is usually, yes, but when they find something that they're very interested in, what typically happens? So when we look at people who are diagnosed with ADHD or ADD, if they're very interested in the project they're doing, they tend to actually be more hyper-focused on it. And so these are just a few of the things that we can really look forward to in saying, like, wow, these are skill sets that this community has that is really outstanding and can be really great for as an employee, as a friend, as a partner, all of those type of things. So one of the things that I really want to tease out for everybody is that neurodiversity is not a mental health condition. Okay. And a lot of people come and go, well, that doesn't make sense. What do you mean? Neurodiversity is a set of neurological differences that we identify, usually in childhood, but sometimes not until adulthood, that set people apart and say, okay, this brain has developed a certain way and needs a different set of skills in life in order to be successful, right? So it's not a mental health condition. It's not something like depression or anxiety where you're coping with it. It's really looking at it from a brain perspective and a developmental perspective and saying, okay, this person thinks and processes information differently. Their brain makes different connections. So how can we support in a different way? And that's really what it's about. So I just want to give a little bit of history of neurodiversity and what that actually looks like and how it came about. So Judy Singer, an Australian sociologist, coined the word neurodiversity in 1998. And really she did this because she wanted to have people recognize that there is a unique community in our world that develops a little bit differently, right? Their brain develops in a different way, in a unique way. And it's also, she wanted to help destigmatize that as a mental health condition, right? So she wanted to say, okay, let's look at some of these conditions like dyslexia, autism, ADD, ADHD, those type of things. Destigmatize it where it's not, it's not an illness. It's not something that has to be fixed necessarily. It's a different way of thinking or looking at the world, and we need to support it in a different way. Oh. Um, the other piece is really understanding, and one of Judy Singer's biggest thing is understanding that none of these differences necessarily prevent a person from experiencing or living a fulfilled life, right? Or understanding what's happening in their community, or collaborating, or being creative, or working in an environment. Um, Again, there are different degrees of these things, and so I want to recognize that, right? Especially when we think about autism and as much research and things that we have discovered about autism, there's different levels of it. And so, yes, there are some people who have severe autism who need a lot of extra support, and this isn't necessarily, this isn't something that they're going to get rid of, right? We don't want to get rid of it, but it's just that we have to support them in a very significant way versus people who might be on a different end of the spectrum, that they are going to be able to function differently in life. And so really looking at these neurodiverse community, it's a spectrum. It's not just, hey, this is the one thing you have, here's your symptoms, and that's it. It's a spectrum of things. Our brain can do really amazing things, and it will develop and link things differently depending on where you're at on that spectrum. And so I think really the term neurodiversity is to highlight the positive differences that are in this community and that are different from what we would call neurotypical people, but also say, hey, like we can all link together and work together and embrace each other, and remove those barriers to work environments, to relationships, to friendships, to those type of things. So let's talk a little bit about how prevalent neurodiversity is. And this, I think, can be really important, especially in our environment today, where again, I think this term is thrown out quite a bit. So prevalence-wise, what we have seen is anywhere between 15 and 20% of the world's population are considered neurodiverse. Again, these are different categories within this community. We look at autism, we look at dyslexia or learning disabilities, or learning struggles. I don't even like to call them disabilities, learning struggles. We also look at people who might have ADD or ADHD. But really, if you look at the entire world, it's anywhere between 15 and 20%, right? I think what happens is when we experience some of these symptoms that might fall into these categories, we automatically say this is what we have, when really looking at it from like a brain perspective and how people have developed and what this looks like prevalence to people's lives is really how we're looking. So I think the next piece I really like to focus on is how people who have cognitive differences have a lot of strength in this creative and innovative space, right? When I work with parents, especially, I talk about this with kids, but I also think this can be really helpful when we have adults in our lives who might be in this community. Because reality is they are very creative, they are very thoughtful, they are really looking outside of the box in order to create things and experience things and have things be understood or solve problems, things like that. And what we really want to do is dig into that, especially when we want to relate relationally with people, right? One of the biggest things I have my families do with their kiddos who are neurodiverse is let's do something artistic, right? Let's do something creative. Now, it's not always like I'm putting a paintbrush to paper or I'm putting a pen to paper and then having them draw. It might be, no, we're building something. No, like let's let them lead us in an activity that they want to do that's creative. In my office, one of the coolest things I have are little pipe cleaner people. I have somebody I work with who makes those, and it's wonderful because that's their way to create and also connect with others through their story and tell their story as well. And so really plugging into this, right? Okay, let's think about how can we be creative with this problem or anything like that and really, utilizing those skills. I think the other piece of this that we can kind of back into as well is allowing them to explain where their creativity is at and connecting with people in a different way. And that can be really helpful and sustainable in relationships as well. So one of the things we also like to talk about is that people who are neurodiverse or who are in this community excel in the STEM activities, right? Um, I think this is something that might be innately people kind of understand or have knowledge about. But really, they do excel in these areas because science, technology, engineering, and math all connect into some creative manner, right? I get a lot of people who go, well, yes, but they're pretty standard, right? You have to follow a formula, you have to do these certain things in it. But in reality, is you also have to be really open to change and dynamic of change. All of these different subjects really highlight that. And I think it's really important to understand that as well, is that science continuously changes, right? New discoveries are made. We have to be open to finding new things. Engineering is similar. Yes, we have a certain formula and things that we look at. However, we have to be open to that might change and we might find something better. We might discover something new. Most of us are in technology, right? And so when we think about technology, it is always changing and innovating and moving forward. And so I think really remembering that these are creative sciences that we're looking at as well. So the other thing I like to explain to people is people who are in the neurodiverse community really process the world differently, right? Um, and remembering that when we are connecting or interacting or, supporting them, either from a manager to an employee or from a parent to a child or a caregiver to a child, this can be really helpful to understand. They just don't see the world the same. Um, their social and communication styles are often very different. Most of the time, they are very direct, they are very to the point. And that doesn't negate that I want to also extend the courtesy that sometimes it seems really stopped, right? Sometimes it seems very abrupt. It feels like, oh my gosh, like, why is this person always being so black and white or so like aggressive or whatever that looks like? And reality is they really focus on kind of what's black and white, what I can see and feel versus what I can't. Gray areas can get really confusing, and that's just not the world they live in. So they just have a different way of communicating and different social abilities in that way. A lot of times their learning methods are different too. I have a kiddo who is neurodiverse, and she's a kiddo that she um does not learn well when people are talking at her, right? So she does terrible in lecture learning. She does not like it. It's not something she will ever remember. She will never gain anything out of it. But if she can see it, if she can feel it, if she can work with it, she understands far more than what people expect of her, right? And that's because her brain can work faster than most people's. And so she can make connections quickly, but she has to touch it. She has to see it. She has to mold with it. Otherwise, it doesn't connect with her. Attention spans are also different, right? So some people who are in the neurodiverse community can focus on something for hours, days, weeks, or months. Others do not do that as well. But it's really focusing on what area do people land in and how do we find strength in that, right? Somebody who can concentrate longer might need to be on a long-term project, where other people might need to be in more of a creative space. How do I problem solve and get creative for a short period of time and pass that off to somebody else who can take it further down the road? The other piece I talk with people a lot about is people in the neurodiverse community often have sensory processing things, meaning that they can get overwhelmed by certain things easier, or they pay attention to certain things more. So, again, I will use my experience as an example. My kiddo does not do well in noisy environments, right? They get overwhelmed very quickly because their brain can't process what's going on in outside of their environment as well as internally. So it's hard. So we take some steps in order to help them regulate through that. Other people, it's like, no, I actually do really great in auditory environments, but if I don't have really good lighting, that's bothering, or things like that. And so I think understanding that, and again, then we can work with that in a different way. We can support in a different way, right? Maybe we have different lighting things or different noise things that we need to make sure that we can provide in order for people to function the way that they need to. So one of the things that I also really like to talk with people about is how the neurodiversity community can teach us. I think this is a big one that a lot of people um, kind of look at, and especially with kids, right? When we're working with kids or we're working with people we're caring for, or even partners, sometimes this can be really hard because it's hard for us to think outside our own box. And so it's really challenging us to be like, okay, how do I get uncomfortable and understand where their box is and where they're at? But that's a part of it, right? Being able to look outside of the box is huge. And people who are neurodiverse oftentimes have to. That is initially where their brain goes, is not looking for solutions that we're used to, but looking for things far beyond what, neurotypical people do. And so being able to kind of work with that and say, okay, let me actually like place myself where you're at, and then how do you explain to me what we need to do, right? What's the solution? What are the efficiency things? Maybe we need to ask more detail from them because they probably have that because it's inside their head already. The other thing is being able to embrace differences rather than categorize them as problematic. We talk about this in a lot of my presentations, right? I don't ever see even mental health things as a problem. There are things that we need to work with in life. But neurodiversity is really culminating of that, right? It is kind of a stamp saying, yeah, my brain developed differently. It works a little differently. And so now I have to embrace that and see how to work in life differently, right? How to ask for support differently, what I need versus what I don't need, because it's not going to be what's natural to everybody. But I need to embrace that and feel confident in myself and what I bring to the table versus seeing it as a problem that I'm different, I'm not okay, I'm not good enough, because none of that is actually true. And so I actually really like to work with this community because really thinking for them of like, yeah, how do we also use our viewpoint as this is a big strength? How can we also help others view their things as strengths, right? Because that's really what it is. The other thing is creating healthy adaptations, um, meaning that a lot of people who are in the neurodiverse community are often far better at coping with things than people who are not. And the reason is because they've had to their whole lives, right? We've had to learn how to adapt, how to manage, how to ask for our needs to be met, how to be straightforward. And all of those things are strengths, right? And so when we have people who are in this community, really looking at it like that, like, wow, they've adapted their whole life and they're really good at it. They also probably have to adapt by taking a lot of breaks, by doing things that are going to regulate them rather than stress them out, right? Doing things that are going to ground them rather than stress them out. And really picking up and saying, wow, I can practice some of those too in order to live a healthier lifestyle. Um, I think the other thing is when we're working with people, either from a supervisor to employee or even employee, really embracing that creative and innovation that people have, right? And then also not letting that get us down. What I hear a lot with partners or things like that when we're working with people who are part of the neurodiverse community is, well, I always feel like I'm so dumb, or I don't feel like I'm as creative, and I always feel like I'm less than, or whatever. Reality is you're not. We all have differences. We all have different abilities and things that we work with or have to work through. And we can learn from each other, right? And really embracing that sense of learning from each other is huge. When we can say, okay, actually, I'm not less than, they just have a different ability than I do. How do we work together, right? And how do I maybe listen to their solutions and what they think, and then add in my own that might be more realistic, or might we might be able to combine these two things together and looking at it from that way. And also understanding that a lot of times people in the neurodiverse community are very pragmatic, right? Um, Meaning that they're going to ask for the things that they need. If they need to exercise, or if they know they need to exercise, they're going to do so without embarrassment, right? If they know they need to do something, they're going to just say it straight out, and understanding that that's not an offense. That's just how life works for them, right? They've always had to do that. They've had to be very clear, very pragmatic, and all of that, and very direct most of the time, because that's how their brain works and that's the way that they can understand their world and also cope with the world that they've been placed into. So the other piece is really how do we support this community and work environments and being really open to what people may need. Um, I think as leaders, sometimes this is hard for us to do, right? Because we don't always know what the answer is, even if we're well-meaning. So the first thing I tell people all the time is ask. Just ask. Most people who are part of the neurodiverse community know what they need and know how to get it. And so if we just say, hey, like, tell me what you need in order to be successful, they'll probably tell you what, just straight out, very clear, very pragmatic. Here's what we need. I think the other thing is instead of assuming that everybody can thrive under a certain way, being open around, okay, maybe they need a different type of support. And how do we work with that within our team, within our current culture or condition that we have now? And how do we be creative in that, right? So they might need more breaks. We might need, to really have long focused projects. Is that an ability to have that happen? Can we create a streamline of ways that we can get that creativity or that focus to detail and really have people thrive within their strengths? I think that is something that really helps leadership in all sorts of ways, but also especially in this community of like, how do we help people thrive within the strengths that they have? And um, we know that that needs to be a part of it, right? I think also reminding ourselves that people in the neurodiverse community, and I will actually probably say this, people in general, the just try harder or just try to fit into this box more is not a solution, right? We can't just fit into a box. Human beings are different and dynamic. And I think then that challenges us to really look creatively of how to support and how to also help our team support each other within these different communities and maybe under different conditions. Like we need to be able to understand and all work together in a healthier environment. So, how can leaders empower the neurodiverse community? I think one of the biggest things is really focusing on some of these sensory pieces, right? Can people work hybrid? Is it easier to say, okay, if you need music to focus, is that possible? And how do we do that in a respectful way? If we need noise canceling headphones or headsets, can we do that? If we need to work in different lighting, how can we do that? Right? Like, I cannot have fluorescent lights on in my office. I don't like them, but also I work with a lot of people that it very much bothers them. So I have different lighting. Is that an availability in where we're at? I think the other thing is also being really open to people needing different types of material from us in order to make sure that they're understanding and getting the information that we're providing. So maybe we need to record our messages. Maybe we need to write them down. Maybe we need to send PowerPoints or have things like that that are more visual. Maybe we need to follow up for a 5 minute discussion after just to ensure that they are intaking the things that we want them to intake. That's something that I think even in schools, I advocate for a lot with kids and adolescents. Like, hey, just because we think they heard it doesn't actually mean that happened. So how do we follow up and ensure that they did, right? How do we figure out how they learn best and really use those tools in order for people to be successful in what we want them to be successful in? The other piece that can be super helpful is flexible work schedules. Now, I know working from home, we all say we have a more flexible work schedule and all of that. However, it's really saying, okay, um, can we take breaks throughout the day? Are there things that maybe my employees need, like an hour off at lunch instead of 30 minutes in order for them to go take a walk or to do things that they need to do in order to refocus and come back? And how do we make sure that we can make that work? Maybe they need to start later in the day, right? Or maybe they need to start earlier and end earlier, whatever that needs to look like, being open and thoughtful about how we work with some of these pieces. I think the best question to always ask, however, is how can we support each other, right? If we can ask that question, or even if we can, start saying, okay, maybe we don't know, but is there ways to find out together? It makes it a lot easier for us than to say, okay, um, I can be open and flexible to the best of my ability because I'm asking somebody else to do the same. and really focusing on that together. Like it might both be uncomfortable, but together we can be successful. I think sometimes that's a really important thing to remember. So I really like this quote. We must welcome, accommodate, and support a wider range of normal, and only then will we benefit from the extraordinary differences the diverse minds can bring. Again, really being open and understanding that it's not a mental health condition, right? Neurodiversity is not mental health. It is really that our brain has developed differently and is structured differently, and we just need to be able to support that and watch the success happen. So here's just some information about myself. And then I want to leave this up for the clinic and what that looks like. And of course, any questions or things that anybody has, please feel free to ask. You can also reach out these ways and ask the questions as well. And yeah, I feel so appreciative that everybody joined today in order to learn a little bit more about this community.